She sat on the park bench every morning at 7:30 a.m., a worn backpack beside her and a small boy with serious brown eyes on her lap. Margaret Wilson was 62 years old, and until 18 months ago, she had been Mrs. Wilson to 3 generations of third graders at Lincoln Elementary School. Now she was just another face among the city's invisible, a grandmother caring for her grandson in the only classroom left to them, the world. Her hands, once steady enough to guide a child's fingers around a pencil, now shook slightly as she opened the battered math workbook she'd salvaged from her old classroom. 8-year-old Danny leaned against her chest, his small finger tracing the numbers on the page as she whispered explanations that only he could hear. 7 times 8 equals 56, she said softly, her voice carrying the patience of 37 years in education. Remember the pattern we practiced yesterday? Danny nodded, his concentration absolute. He didn't know that other children his age were sitting in warm classrooms with full bellies and futures that seemed certain. All he knew was that Grandma Rose, his name for her since he was 3, made learning feel like a treasure hunt, even when they were hunting for those treasures on a park bench. What Margaret Wilson didn't know was that across the park, a man in his 50s was watching them with growing recognition and mounting concern. Staff Sergeant Robertson, retired Marine, had been taking his morning jogs through Riverside Park for 6 months. And for the past 2 weeks, he'd noticed the same elderly woman and young boy, there before sunrise, still there when other families arrived for afternoon playtime. Today, something about the woman's voice, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, made him stop running and start paying attention. And when he heard her gently correct the boy's math, when he saw the careful way she'd organized their few belongings, when he noticed the faded gold star pin on her thin jacket, the pin that military families knew meant she'd lost a child in service, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just another homeless situation. This was a Gold Star mother, and something had gone very, very wrong. Welcome to Untold Hidden Stories. Before we dive into this powerful story of loss, resilience, and community redemption, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Sometimes the people who've given the most are the ones who need our help the most. Margaret Rose Wilson had spent 37 years shaping young minds at Lincoln Elementary School, where she was known for her firm but loving approach to education and her ability to reach children that other teachers had given up on. She believed every child could learn, every child deserved patience, and every child needed to know they mattered. Her daughter Sarah had been one of those children who mattered immensely. Sarah Wilson-Martinez had grown up in Margaret's classroom after school, doing homework at the back desk, learning to love learning by watching her mother work. When Sarah announced she was joining the Army after college, Margaret's heart had swelled with pride even as it ached with worry. "I want to serve something bigger than myself, Mom," Sarah had said, wearing her dress blues for the first time. "You taught me that. You taught me that education and service go together." Sarah served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, saving lives and writing letters home full of stories about Afghan children who reminded her of her mother's students, curious, resilient, deserving of hope. Between tours, she married David Martinez, a fellow soldier who'd grown up in foster care and found family in the Army. Their son Danny was born in 2014, a perfect child who inherited his mother's compassion and his father's quiet strength. For 3 golden years, Margaret watched her daughter balance motherhood and military service while David transitioned to civilian work as an electrician. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2017, while Margaret was teaching fractions to a room full of 8-year-olds. Principal Davies appeared in her doorway with the expression that every military family member learns to dread, and Margaret knew before he said a word that her world was about to change forever. Sarah had been killed by an improvised explosive device while treating wounded civilians in a village outside Kabul. She was 31 years old, a mother, a medic, and a daughter who would never come home. The military honors, the funeral, the folded flag, it all passed in a blur of ceremony and casseroles and visitors who meant well but couldn't fill the Sarah-shaped hole in Margaret's universe. 3-year-old Danny didn't understand why Mommy wasn't coming back from her work trip, and David, devastated by the loss of his wife and struggling to raise a toddler alone, leaned heavily on Margaret for support. For 2 years, they managed. Margaret retired from teaching to help with Danny, finding purpose in watching him grow and learn, seeing Sarah's curiosity and kindness reflected in every question he asked, every hug he gave. David worked long hours to support them, but he made time for bedtime stories and weekend adventures, building the kind of father-son relationship he'd never had himself. Then came the second phone call that destroyed what remained of Margaret's world. David was killed in a car accident on a rainy Friday evening in April 2019, returning home from a job site when a drunk driver ran a red light and ended Danny's father's life in an instant. 5-year-old Danny became an orphan, and Margaret, at age 60, became the only family he had left. The grief was overwhelming, but Margaret had no time to collapse. Danny needed stability, needed love, needed someone to make sense of a world that had taken both his parents before he was old enough to understand death. Margaret sold her small house to pay for David's funeral and Danny's immediate needs, assuming her teacher's pension and Social Security would be enough to support them. She was wrong. The pension was smaller than she'd expected, eaten up by administrative fees and early withdrawal penalties she hadn't anticipated. Social Security helped, but not enough to cover rent, utilities, food, and the costs of raising an active, growing child. Within 6 months, Margaret had burned through her savings trying to keep them in their apartment. When the eviction notice came, Margaret made a decision that broke her heart but preserved her dignity. She would not burden anyone else with their problems. She would not become a charity case for her former colleagues, would not beg family members who had their own struggles, would not put Danny in foster care when he'd already lost so much. Instead, she sold everything they couldn't carry, packed their lives into 2 backpacks and a small rolling suitcase, and disappeared into the invisible population of America's homeless families. For 18 months, Margaret Wilson had been raising her grandson without an address. They moved between shelters when space was available, stayed in her ancient Honda Civic when it wasn't, and spent their days in public spaces, libraries, parks, community centers, anywhere they could exist without drawing attention or pity. Margaret never stopped being a teacher. She turned every moment into a lesson, every challenge into an opportunity for Danny to learn resilience, critical thinking, problem-solving. They practiced math with coins and food items, learned geography by tracking their travels around the city, studied science by observing weather patterns and animal behavior in the parks where they spent their days. Danny was enrolled in school under Margaret's sister's address, a small deception that ensured he had access to education and school meals while protecting him from questions about his living situation. Margaret had taught long enough to know how quickly children could be removed from families deemed unstable, and she was determined to keep Danny safe and together with her, even if their togetherness looked different from most families. To the outside world, they were just another grandmother and grandson enjoying the park. Margaret's dignity never faltered, her appearance remained neat despite their circumstances, and Danny's brightness and curiosity showed no signs of the instability that defined their daily lives. But Staff Sergeant Robert Chin wasn't the outside world. He was a veteran who'd learned to read situations, to notice details that others missed, and to recognize distress even when it was carefully hidden. The gold star pin was the first clue. The second was the way Margaret's clothes were clean but thin, worn but cared for. The third was the systematic way she approached their park time, the same bench, the same routine, the same careful attention to their surroundings that spoke of someone who'd had to become very good at managing uncertainty. The fourth clue was Danny himself. Chin had grandchildren, and he knew the difference between a child visiting the park and a child who lived in public spaces. Danny was too comfortable, too accustomed to the routine, two practiced at entertaining himself quietly while Margaret worked with him on lessons that looked suspiciously like homeschooling. On his third morning of careful observation, Chin approached their bench during his cool-down stretches, pretending to use the nearby exercise equipment while listening to Margaret help Danny with reading comprehension. The character in the story felt scared because he was in a new place, Margaret was saying. "Have you ever felt that way, sweetheart?" "When we first came to this park," Danny replied matter-of-factly. "But now it feels safe because you're here." Chen's heart broke a little. That wasn't the answer of a child visiting a park. That was the answer of a child who'd been taught to adapt to new places, to find safety in his grandmother's presence rather than in familiar surroundings. After his workout, Chin approached them directly, his military bearing obvious but his demeanor carefully non-threatening. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stopping near their bench. "I couldn't help but notice your gold star pin. I'm Robert Chin, Marine Corps, retired. Would it be appropriate for me to ask about your daughter's service?" Margaret looked up at him with the wariness of someone who'd learned to be careful with strangers, but she also recognized something in his manner, the respectful formality, the genuine interest, the way he'd asked permission before asking personal questions. "Staff Sergeant Sarah Wilson-Martinez," she said quietly. "Army medic. Afghanistan, 2017. Chen removed his baseball cap and nodded with the reverence that one military family member shows another. "She died saving lives, didn't she?" "She lived saving lives," Margaret corrected gently. "She died doing what she was called to do." "And this handsome young man?" "My grandson Danny. Sarah's boy." Chin knelt to Danny's level, understanding instinctively that this child had learned to be polite to adults but might be shy with strangers. "What are you studying today, Danny?" "Reading and math," Danny replied. "Grandma Rose is the best teacher in the world. She used to teach in a real school, but now she just teaches me. Used to teach and just teaches me." Chin filed those phrases away along with everything else he was observing, the careful organization of their belongings, the way Margaret checked her watch frequently, the fact that they were here every day at the same time. "Well, you're lucky to have such a good teacher," Chin told Danny. Then, to Margaret, "Ma'am, would it be all right if I visited with you again sometime? I have grandchildren myself, and it's nice to see a young man getting such dedicated attention to his education." Margaret nodded cautiously. There was something about this man that felt safe, familiar. The military bearing, the respectful approach, the way he'd honored Sarah's service before asking personal questions. Chen returned the next morning, and the morning after that. Gradually, through careful conversation and gentle questions, he began to piece together their story. Margaret never said directly that they were homeless, never asked for help, never complained about their circumstances. But Chen had been in the Marines long enough to read between the lines. The turning point came a week later, when Danny mentioned during their conversation that he was excited about the school's upcoming Veterans Day assembly. "I'm going to tell my class about my mom and how she was a hero," Danny said proudly. "And about how Grandma Rose teaches me everything." "Does your class know your grandmother was a teacher?" Chin asked. "She still is a teacher," Danny corrected. "She teaches me every day. Just not in a school building anymore." After Danny ran off to play on the nearby playground, Chin looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Wilson, how long has it been since you had a permanent address?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Danny climb on the monkey bars with the careful attention of someone who couldn't afford for anything bad to happen to the only family she had left. 18 months, she said finally. Since just after David, Danny's father, passed away. And you've been managing his education yourself. I've been managing everything myself. There was no self-pity in her voice, just quiet pride and exhaustion. Danny doesn't know we're any different from other families. He thinks this is normal, and I intend to keep it that way until I can do better. Chin nodded, understanding the fierce dignity that would make a woman choose homelessness over admitting she couldn't handle her responsibilities. Mrs. Wilson, would you be offended if I asked some other veterans to help me help you? Margaret stiffened slightly. We don't need charity, Mr. Chin. No, ma'am, you don't. What you need is recognition. What you need is for people to understand that caring for a Gold Star family is not charity, it's honor. It's the very least we can do for someone who's already given everything. That afternoon, Chin made a series of phone calls. The first was to Tom Bradley, a fellow Marine who worked for the county's Veteran Services Department. The second was to Patricia Reeves, an Army veteran who ran a nonprofit focused on military families. The third was to Maria Santos, a Navy veteran who worked in the school district's administration office and might know Margaret's reputation as an educator. By evening, Chin had confirmed what he'd suspected. Margaret Wilson had been beloved at Lincoln Elementary, had retired with full honors, and had simply vanished from her colleagues' awareness after David's death. No one knew she was struggling because she'd been too proud to let them know. Within 48 hours, a quiet network of veterans, educators, and community advocates had mobilized around Danny and Margaret's situation. Not with fanfare or publicity, but with the systematic efficiency that military families bring to solving problems. Tom Bradley discovered that Margaret was eligible for several benefits she'd never applied for: surviving family member support, emergency housing assistance, and educational grants that could help her return to teaching if she wanted. Patricia Reeves connected them with temporary housing in a program specifically designed for military families in transition. Maria Santos learned that Lincoln Elementary had been hoping to bring Margaret back as a substitute teacher, not knowing she was available. But the most important call Chin made was to the local veterans organization, where he stood up at the next monthly meeting and told Margaret and Danny's story. We talk a lot about supporting our troops and honoring Gold Star families, he said to the room full of veterans from every branch of service, every era of conflict. Here's a Gold Star mother who lost her daughter in Afghanistan, then lost her son-in-law in a car accident, and has been raising her 8-year-old grandson alone for 2 years. She's been homeless for 18 months, but you'd never know it because she's maintained that boy's education, his dignity, and his faith in the world despite losing everything. She's not asking for our help. She's not asking for anything. But we're going to help her anyway, because that's what we do. We don't leave people behind, and we don't let Gold Star families fall through the cracks on our watch. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 2 weeks, the local veterans community had raised enough money to cover first and last month's rent on a small apartment near Danny's school. The school district had offered Margaret a permanent position as a reading specialist. The VA had expedited her benefits applications. Local businesses had donated furniture, clothes, and school supplies. But more importantly, they'd created a support network, a military family that would ensure Margaret and Danny never faced their challenges alone again. The day Margaret and Danny moved into their new apartment was Danny's 9th birthday. As they walked into the small but clean 2-bedroom space with its donated furniture and stocked refrigerator, Danny looked around in wonder. "Grandma Rose," he said, "does this mean we don't have to live in the park anymore?" "No, sweetheart," Margaret replied, her voice thick with tears she'd held back for 18 months. "We get to live here now. But we'll still visit the park. It's a good park. Can we invite Mr. Chin to visit us here?" "Of course we can." That evening, As Danny explored his new bedroom and Margaret sat in an actual kitchen and an actual table for the first time in over a year, she thought about Sarah and David. About the sacrifices they'd made, the love they'd shared, and the legacy they'd left in the curious, resilient, wonderful boy who was now drawing pictures of their new home with crayons donated by strangers who'd become family. Margaret returned to teaching that fall, working as a reading specialist with children who struggled with literacy, children who reminded her, sometimes, of Danny during those months when their only classroom was the world around them. She brought to her work a deeper understanding of how quickly circumstances could change, how important it was to see the whole child and not just their academic performance, and how much difference it could make when someone refused to give up on a kid. Danny thrived in his new stability, but he never forgot the lessons his grandmother had taught him during their months of uncertainty. He was more curious about the world than his classmates, more adaptable to change, more appreciative of simple comforts. And he was proud, deeply, unshakably proud, of the woman who had sacrificed everything to keep him safe, educated, and loved. Staff Sergeant Chin became Uncle Bob, a permanent fixture in their lives who helped with homework, attended school events, and made sure Margaret knew she had backup if she ever needed it. The network of veterans who'd rallied around them became an extended family, proof that military service creates bonds that extend far beyond official duty. 3 years later, Margaret Wilson was named Teacher of the Year by her district, recognized for her innovative approaches to helping struggling readers and her deep understanding of how trauma and instability could affect learning. In her acceptance speech, she talked about learning from her grandson during the most difficult period of their lives. "Danny taught me that education doesn't require a building or a budget," she said. "It requires attention, patience, and love. He taught me that resilience isn't about not falling down, it's about getting back up and finding ways to keep moving forward. And he taught me that family isn't just about who you're related to, it's about who shows up when you need them most." Danny, now 12 years old, was in the audience that night, sitting between Uncle Bob and Aunt Patricia and beaming with pride at his Grandma Rose. Later, a reporter asked him what he thought about his grandmother's award. "She's always been the best teacher," he said matter-of-factly. "She taught me math on park benches and science by watching clouds and history by telling me stories about my mom and dad. She never stopped being a teacher, even when we didn't have a classroom." Margaret Wilson had lost a daughter to war and a son-in-law to tragedy. She'd lost her home, her financial security, and 18 months of stability. But she'd never lost her dignity, her dedication to Danny's welfare, or her belief that every child deserved the best education possible, regardless of circumstances. And in return, she'd gained something precious, the knowledge that service families take care of their own, that teaching is about much more than buildings and budgets, and that love, real, enduring, sacrificial love, can create stability even in the most unstable circumstances. The gold star pin still adorns her jacket, a quiet symbol of loss and service. But now it's joined by other pins: Teacher of the Year, Volunteer Appreciation, Community Service Awards, symbols of a life rebuilt with the help of people who understood that honoring military families means more than just saying thank you. It means showing up, paying attention, and refusing to let anyone who's given so much fall through the cracks. Margaret Wilson teaches reading to struggling students in a bright classroom filled with books and hope. Danny Wilson-Martinez studies in that classroom after school sometimes, just like his mother once did, absorbing lessons about learning and service and the importance of taking care of each other. And every morning, before school starts, Margaret still sits on a bench in Riverside Park, not because she has to, but because she chooses to. It's a good park, a place where she learned that dignity can survive almost anything, that love can create stability in the most unstable circumstances, and that sometimes the people who look like they need help the most are actually the ones teaching the most important lessons of all. Staff Sergeant Sarah Wilson-Martinez died serving her country, but her legacy lives on in the grandson she never got to see grow up and in the mother who refused to let tragedy have the final word. Margaret Wilson learned that teaching isn't just a job, it's a calling that survives job loss, homelessness, and heartbreak. And Danny learned that family isn't just about who you're born to, it's about who refuses to give up on you when everything else falls apart. Some lessons can only be learned on park benches. Some teachers can only be found among the invisible. And sometimes, the most important education happens not in classrooms, but in the love that refuses to let go, even when everything else is lost.